Berman Institute Noontime Seminar of 2016. It's delighted to see so many of you here. Today we have a great treat. One of the wonderful things about Johns Hopkins is that we get colleagues, new colleagues, although not so new now, 3 years ago, right?
Still new.
Who have such broad interest and wonderful expertise, and so often that expertise and that interest extends to promotive questions, and so it's wonderful for the Berman Institute, for our community generally, when that happens. Dr. Jeremy Greene is a colleague here. We'll go through all his titles in a moment. By background, Jeremy is both an internist and a historian. And now I will do the titles. He's an associate professor of history of medicine, here in the School of Medicine, and he's also the Elizabeth Tribe and A. McGehee Harvey Chair in the History of Medicine. Jeremy is the author of 2 books already. Okay? The first one, which won the Rachel Carson Prize in 2009, which is a super big deal prize for those of us who, I only know about it tangentially, but it is a super big deal prize. It was titled Prescribing by Numbers, and that was in 2009. This is just going to give you a sense of his interests. His most recent book is called Generic, The Unbranding of Modern Medicine. And now the third book, which apparently is going to be a 2-volume opus, maybe, is Medicine or Healing at a Distance. I'm not sure what your title is. You have a chance to play with the title,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Jeremy is a distinguished historian of medicine, as you can tell. I'm sure he's also a competent internist, but I've never had him as a physician, so I can't tell you. And I know he's a very distinguished and able historian of medicine who is very, very interested and works at the intersection of history and bioethics, which we are thrilled about. He is currently a Greenwald Scholar, which is a big deal as well. It's a very competitive process. We have been fortunate now to have had more than one, so we are the 3rd Greenwald Scholar at Johns Hopkins, and it is a prestigious award that allows generally a mid-career faculty member to get release time to do really innovative work in bioethics, in this case bioethics history. So please join me in welcoming Jeremy not to Hopkins, but to our Noontime Seminar series.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Thanks to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here today. And I still feel like I've just arrived at Johns Hopkins, although I realize it's been a few years. But it's really a pleasure to have this chance to get to know the Berman Center, which I'm looking forward to spending more time in conversation with all of you. And as we've mentioned, I feel very fortunate to have this opportunity to speak with you. What's really at the beginning of this new project funded by a Greenwald faculty scholarship. And one of the things I find really so interesting about the Greenwald Foundation is their support for interface work in the field of bioethics. Many other people who have received the scholarship are from the field of anthropology or legal scholarship. And I come to this as a historian, but all of us use these different social science perspectives to engage with asking questions in the field of bioethics. And again, this idea of having a broader conversation between history and the field of bioethics is something that I'm particularly interested in, especially as we have these conversations around technologies. And so many of the conversations that the field of bioethics gets engaged in have to do with the problem of emerging technologies and what we do with technologies that are new and whose social relations have not yet been figured out, and we try to anticipate. And so much of the ELSI funding, for example, to the NIH has to do with this anticipatory need for what the social consequences of new technologies will be. I actually think history has a lot to offer to that conversation, but it requires a frame shift in which we look at old technologies and understand that they also were once new, and that something can be gleaned through that interaction. And I offer this slide not just to try and sell my books to you, but to suggest that the technologies that I've been asking questions about in my career so far have largely been therapeutic technologies. I have 2 monographs in an edited volume that all has to do with the history of the prescription drug. And in a way that I I hope to utilize historical analysis in these books to inform and broach new ethical concerns about the ethics of clinical trials, of pharmaceutical utilization, both from the clinical ethics of these questions to the broader distributed public health ethics questions as well. And today's talk, however, is really from the beginning of this research project on a different form of technology, which is a communications technology. And what I'd like to ask today is what can the history of old technologies, like the telephone, teach us about the future of telemedicine? And I'd like to ask if any of you know this painting over here. Have any of you seen it before?
South Day.
It's a good guess, but no, this is Gustave Chambry, Cubist painting, 1916. And some of you might be able to guess what it is. It's a telephone, exactly. And so here you have this telephone. When I show this to rooms full of medical students, they often assume it's a microscope. And I think that comparison is something I'd like to keep in mind. Chambry was painting a telephone, which at this point was still a very exciting new communications technology of its day. And he, using a cubist portrayal, is trying to see it from many different angles. And I'd like to do something like that in the course of this talk, use historical analysis to defamiliarize the old technology of the telephone, understand what it looked like when it was new. Electronic media, of course, are the center of most of our conversations about mHealth, telehealth, telemedicine today. Electronic media now determine how tens of millions of Americans and many others around the world access healthcare. And this new reach of medicine at a distance promises to break down geographical disparities in access, to alter the fundamental modes of communication, the doctor-patient relationship, and to reshape the production, circulation, and consumption of medical knowledge as we know it. And as the 2012 IOM report on the left here, called The Role of Telehealth in an Evolving Healthcare Environment noted, an explosion of smart medical devices and recent federal investments in health information infrastructure, not least of which being the passage of the Affordable Care Act, has positioned telemedicine, or telehealth, as a key means for providing better care and better health at lower costs. So there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm around this field of telemedicine, and we see this both in domestic arenas, we see it in the private marketplace as well as in public health discussions. And the top right now, only one of many things that you can buy if you want to hack and develop your own telehealth system. eHealth sensor platform, 10 devices, apps in one, wow. And on the bottom right here, we see one of many images showing the deployment of telemedical technologies and trying to bridge disparities in access of care. Oftentimes, in this case, we have a teleophthalmological device for visualizing retinas. This is a resident in global health at Massachusetts General Hospital who is exactly where he is. This is terrible when I'm being recorded. He's working at the Albert Schweitzer Hospital in Gabon and has gone upriver to send retinal images of children back to ophthalmologists at MGH to make diagnostics available that would not otherwise be available. Of course, this is also tied to the promotion of a technology that is looking for buyers in North American markets as well. And to look at other forms of popularization, I would suggest the broad enthusiasm around how the smartphone, as Eric Topol has put it, the future of medicine is in your smartphone. All the liberatory promise for patients to be free of needing to come to clinics if they can do more work simply through this disruptive technology. Now, I want to suggest there's also a tremendous amount of anxiety of the ethical concerns that telemedicine brings as well. This expansion of telemedicine has opened up many challenges for both the fields of STS, right, science and technology studies more generally, and bioethics in particular. Can all forms of medical communication take place equally effectively through electronic media, or will some diagnoses be missed without person-to-person contact? Are the benefits of electronically mediated medicine equally available to everyone, or do they favor some kinds of patients over others, or some kinds of practitioners over others? What hidden dangers lurk in technologies that make sensitive biomedical information mobile for a variety of licit and illicit uses on the internet? And these questions, I would argue, have been asked so far in historically very thin ways. Now, here we see, even just this last June, the American Medical Association tabled the formation of a set of telemedical ethics rules that was taking place at the moment. Recent attempts of the AMA to codify the space of telemedicine within the AMA Code of Ethics faltered as delegates could not come to an agreement over whether electronically mediated interactions could count as a permissible space to make first contact between the doctor and patient and establish that crucial moment of establishing the ethical responsibility that would take place within the doctor-patient relationship. And these bioethical debates tend to take the present day as a starting point. There may be a space 5 years ago as a starting point. And in doing so, I want to argue we missed similar pairings of enthusiasm and caution in the reception of earlier medical communication technologies, from telephones to telemetry recorders, fax machines to emails. Analogous pairings of breathless wonder and deep, deep anxiety can be found in the medical and popular reception of analog communication technology as well. And this is the image that was attached to the flyer for this talk. This is by the great German interwar medical illustrator Fritz Kahn, and he titled this, of course, in German, The Doctor of the Future. And what you see is a physician, cigarette dangling from his lips in a cavalier continental style, with a switchboard of patients' names in front of him that represents most likely a hospital ward. And he has all of these analog media in front of him that connect him to those patients. So we see the Hertz tone, you can listen to the sound of the patient's heart, we have blood pressure, we have the x-ray, we have tracings of temperature and electrocardiogram, and of course by his right shoulder, the telephone. And analogous, so this pairing is something I'd like to come into contact with. Here is an enthusiastic, perhaps, portrayal of the potentials of what we could call telemedicine in 1939. So why don't we know more about this history? Well, one of the reasons we miss these historical analogs is because the kinds of histories we tend to tell ourselves about technology are typically first written by technologists themselves. For example, here's a timeline from a book on the history of telemedicine, written by a prominent telemedical engineer, which paints history as a straight line of technological accumulation. And it replicates what I would call a Tang history of technology. Telemedicine, like Tang, is something that was developed at a certain time, was deployed, and there's precursors to it. There's civilian consequences of it. But finds civilian applications almost as a secondary benefit. And I particularly like this timeline, which begins on the left with fire, smoke, and water, and it ends on the right with grid computing. But I want to point out that the author of this timeline has still done remarkable historical work. He's a very careful scholar. His name is Rashid Bashir. He's at the University of Michigan. And he turned out to be an agile and fascinating individual. His career saw the expansion of telemedical technologies in the United States move from dream to reality. Bashir's collected papers are at the National Library of Medicine. They form a fascinating resource for understanding how telemedicine developed in this country after the 1960s. But for today's talk, I'd like to dig deeper. I would like to end there, actually, and start in much earlier time periods. And one historical question I'd like to pose is, how did medicine at a distance become a problem that even needed to be solved with electrons? And what I mean by that is to suggest that the assumption we have that telemedicine is a problem because the physical presence of the patient in front of the doctor is crucial to doing that thing that is good medicine is itself actually a really modern set of assumptions. And if I talk to my colleagues who are medievalists or early modernists who barely consider me a historian because I work in the 20th century, but if you look at manuscripts from medieval and early modern sources, a tremendous amount of clinical interaction in the Middle Ages and early modern period took place by epistolary medicine. So patients would write letters, describe their symptoms, send them in to physicians who were academics and liked to work with texts. They were scholars. Physicians did not like to lay hands on the body because that was not actually a key part of diagnosis. A key part of diagnosis was uroscopy, but urine could be, put in a flask one way or another and sent in the mail along with the letter. So the physician would just look at the text of the patient narrative. The urine itself would substitute for a physical examination, and then you would actually give the diagnosis and therapeutic plan. And these plans would take place by mail as well. So this idea of proximity itself being important to medicine, which of course here at Hopkins we associate so closely with this Oslerian ideal that there is a sequence, laying on hands, in which we see even the stethoscope here being part of the contact between the physician and patient. And of course the sequence is, there's these famous photographs that circulate in Osler, the stages of inspection of the patient, palpation, the laying on of hands, auscultation, using the stethoscope to listen to the sources of the body, and then contemplation, and then diagnosis and therapeutics is done. And again, The stethoscope was a medium for actually touching the patient. It was part of this valuing of physical examination, physical diagnosis, which took place really over the 19th and early 20th century. But that I want to point out that many of you, many cardiologists today, will complain that as more and more diagnosis becomes electronically mediated, cardiology fellows are learning to diagnose based on echo rather than using the stethoscope. But the stethoscope itself raised deeper problems for 19th century physicians. Because the stethoscope, which we think of as a way of being close to a patient now, was seen at that time as something providing problematic distance. Again, I want to point out these deep analogs of concerns of telemedicine, medicine at distance, can be found, for example, in the well-known Harvard Medical School dean, Oliver Wendell Holmes' critique of the stethoscope. And Holmes wrote a bit of doggerel, sort of a funny poem about a young physician who went from Boston to get trained in Paris, as was the key center for education in the early 19th century, got one of these new technologies, these stethoscopes, learned how to use it in Paris, brought it back across the Atlantic, and on the transit back, a spider made a web inside of the stethoscope, and 2 flies of different sizes got caught in the web. And then this young physician arrives back in Boston, begins using this new diagnostic technology of the stethoscope, listening to people's chests. And depending on the atmospheric condition in each of the patients, having nothing to do with the condition of the illness itself, one of those flies or another one gets excited. This doctor makes the wrong diagnosis every time, kills all of his patients. And so then you have this answer at the end. This new technology to distance brings dangerous opportunities for problems of signal and noise, and that one should be very careful of trusting these mediated forms of diagnosis. So that we think of the stethoscope as a form of proximity, but actually in the time of its introduction to American medicine, it was treated equally problematically as a form of distance. So what I'd like to do in the time that remains is not dwell on the medieval, early modern 19th century, but focus really on what happens at the very end of the 19th century and the 20th century when technology like the telephone was introduced. And I want to introduce a couple of key questions to how historians think about technology in context. And one is this question of whether technology drives history. And many popular discussions about technology are full of narratives of modern technology as something that unfolds under its own power, contains a new world order within it, much like a bud contains the plan for the next year's growth on a tree, already packaged ahead of time. And Karl Marx, to take one commonly quoted example, asserted in The Poverty of Philosophy that, quote, "The hand mill," right, this is before the Industrial Revolution, "gives you society with the feudal lord. The steam mill," on the right, this industrial era, "gives you society with the industrial capitalist." And historians phrase this as technological determinism. This idea that new technologies produce new social relations and can be arranged in sort of a progressive sequence that forms human civilization. And many histories of communication technology look at it that way, that print gave us this, the telephone gave us this, TV gave us this. And one of the things that we do to try and resist this historically is to insist that social relations get negotiated with every new technology. Another example of this is that the railroad gave us a new form of connection such that we needed to create time zones. And so railroad produced a new form of time that hadn't existed in the United States before. And it's both true on the one hand, that actually time zones did not exist in the United States before the railroad. On the other hand, it wasn't somewhere packed away in the instructions of how to build a railroad that you needed time zones. It was negotiated afterwards. So this is part of the space that I think is crucial for thinking about how we use history of technology to inform the field of bioethics, that these social relations are not pre-programmed with technology. The second is, of course, to focus on the role of users. One way to bring out the role of human agents in history of technology is to emphasize that technologies succeed or fail not because of the inherent quality of the technology, but because of the conditions it enters into. And one example I give is the fax machine, which was first invented in 1843, but not widely used. And so most people don't really see the benefit that fax provides over existing forms of communication. Not really until the 1980s does the actual broad utility of the fax for many general people come to pass. And even then, it's a relatively brief window as the fax has been eclipsed largely by other forms of communication since then. Another way of looking at this is the uprise of cell phones in sub-Saharan Africa, a phenomenon that would surprise many would-be technological determinists. Much of rural Africa, not accessible by wired phone lines in the 1990s, when cheap cell phones became widely available, saw rapid uptake of wireless telephony, skipping straight over wired telephony in the process. So that there's, if we look at the user perspective, we see there's not a clear The third thing is this question that I mentioned right at the very beginning, that something like telemedicine didn't just, when we look at the new technologies today, we tend to discount those technologies we already think of as banal. And what I want to suggest is that history as a form of analysis can offer a way of looking at the period in which a new technology is experimental and known only to a few, when it becomes broadly uptaken and seen as an essential part of modern practice, and then when it becomes routinized and banal, and something that you don't even really see very much of anymore. You don't even see discussion of it, because why talk about something like a telephone? Everyone has a telephone in their office. And I want to suggest this gives a method, and this is really one part of the method that I'm using for this project, is to look for a set of successive insertions of new media in the world of medicine, starting with the telephone in the end of the 19th century, moving to wireless telemetry, which comes out of radio in the early part of the 20th century, then television, and then other satellite and other computer technologies. And suggesting that for each of these technologies, there's a moment in which it's a vanguard, there's a moment in which there's an uptake, and then there's a moment in which we start to forget about it and just take it for granted. And that each of those three moments actually offer instructive modalities for how we consider ethical problems of new emerging technologies in the future. Again, when we defamiliarize the telephone, we can begin to see how it actually is something that looks a lot like a microscope. It could belong in a physiology laboratory in the late 19th century, but then, of course, becomes a common household object later in the 20th century. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to go over these three steps on the telephone, because I want to make sure I leave plenty of time for discussion. I want to suggest it's hard to recapture the rapidity and enthusiasm with which the medical profession began to speculate on possible uses for the telephone, or how sleek and modern, how truly scientific a tool it seemed at that time. Just a few years after Alexander Graham Bell demonstrates telephony in the United States, medical journals begin to fill with scientific articles using the telephone as a piece of high-tech laboratory equipment. And I'll see here's two things. The British Medical Journal, one on the telephone as an electrical reagent for physiological studies. The idea that it's actually a better sensing tool than anything that was existing in physiology laboratories. It's a piece of lab equipment. The second on using the telephone to sound for stone, meaning to actually locate a bladder stone in the body. So using it much the way we might think of something like axial tomography today, or stereotactic imaging for neurosurgery. That this was a cutting-edge technology to see inside the body to figure out where a bladder stone was. That's certainly not how we think of the telephone today. If I were to hold a phone up to my patient's belly and say I was using it to find their bladder stone, I probably wouldn't come back. But we see here again another illustration of the use of the telephone as part of an apparatus to graphically inscribe heart numbers and produce useful physiological data on how the heart functions. So these early uses of the telephone were very, very different than what we think of today. They're actually part of a laboratory structure. This is the vanguard. We begin to see concerns, domains of ethical concern, emerging on what telephones will do to the doctor-patient relationship very early. And the ability to use the telephone to diagnose and treat at a distance was already an object of discussion in the 1870s. So there's one very prominent story in the British Medical Journal on the left, in which a physician receives a call in the middle of the night. A concerned parent thinks that their child might have croup. The physician, rather than get out of bed, get dressed, and make his way to the patient's house, asks for the phone to be held up to the patient's chest. He listens a bit. He says, "Oh, that's not the cough of croup. You can go back to sleep." And stories like this circulated. That this question of whether this was increased efficiency or whether this was an unethical form of practice was already visible in the 1870s. Now, by 1900, however, one sees plans for more general use of telephone to mediate aspects of patient self-report and self-care. Here's an article on the lay use of the clinical thermometer suggesting that if people, as everyday consumers were purchasing this newly available technology of the thermometer, another mundane object that it's hard for us to remember was exclusively a medical technology for some time. Well, only physicians had thermometers until about the 1870s. But as the thermometer finds its way into people's houses around the same time, then the patient becomes capable of making objective reports on their own body, and not just their own subjective analysis of what's happening. And so this is a report on how these new technologies, the thermometer and the telephone, worked used together, could create a possible outreach of how physicians responsibly treat people at a distance. Now, not all voices are as optimistic. If you read the medical literature, you find a waning enthusiasm as early dreams of telemedical practice are dashed or at least dulled. So the Boston physician C.J. Blake, writing in 1890, reported, quote, "When the discoveries of the telephone and microphone were first announced, some very enthusiastic gentlemen went so far as to predict that telephonic consultations would be held, and that eminent special practitioners who, quote, listen to the heartbeats of a nation as a matter of business, would each settle themselves down in the center of a web of wires and auscult at indefinite distances from the patients. The general argument being that an instrument that could make audible the footfall of a fly or the rustling of a camel hair pencil could certainly transmit at their full value the sounds from within the chest cavity, so loudly heard in the stethoscope." And yet they didn't. Long-distance wires did not carry the signals very faithfully. There's problems of attenuation. It was very hard to actually get good sound quality at a distance. So these early dreams of the use of the telephone to establish this broad telemedical practice and actually create a new specialty of telemedical practitioners, well, they didn't use that term at the time, were actually dashed on logistical and technological issues. But you still see broad conversations about these problems as the telephone does get adopted in ways that weren't entirely anticipated at the time. Here's an essay on health organizations and the telephone, in Edinburgh in 1941 in the American Journal of Public Health. I'll quote here, "One could not conduct a modern business, a practice of medicine, or a public health program without a telephone. Upon that much all will agree. But comparatively few of those who use this method of communication recognize it as drawbacks and possesses dangers of doing subtle damage, only belatedly recognizable as such." And many of the damages, these hazards of the telephone, are seen as psychological. Like the possibility that a physician might give offense because of the inability of physical cues in conversation, or the problem of making people wait on a line. But at the same time, they begin to list these sorts of dangers and hazards. And you see this as well, coupled with enthusiasm for the possibilities. Another article from the Psychoanalytic Quarterly in 1951, and Dr. Leon Saul argued that many patients could actually do better getting therapy over the telephone if they had problems of strong transference or countertransference with their therapist. The telephone actually removed that. And I'll quote from Saul, quote, "One wonders if the idea of using modern technology in the form of the telephone as an adjunct to the psychoanalytic technique will be met with horrified resistance, or whether most analysts are already far ahead of this in their thinking and can already anticipate experimenting with televisual communication in and when this becomes practicable." So in different domains of medicine, psychiatry becomes a very important domain for experimenting with telemedical encounters, first through the telephone and then with television. You see different phases of enthusiasm or skepticism. I would suggest also, as the doctor-patient relationship is being thought out as a series of ethical opportunities and problems for physicians to the telephone, we see this conversation shifts on the changing burden of clinical work the telephone brings with it as well. An opinion piece in The Lancet already objected to increasing connectivity at a cost for physicians in 1883, quote, "As if the telegraph and the post office did not sufficiently invade and molest our leisure, it is now proposed to medical men that they should become subscribers to the telephone company, and so lay themselves open to communications from all quarters and all times." And I hold this object up, I'll pass this around. This is an answer page from the late 1960s. And again, we assume, or at least generations of physicians assume, that the pager, that the constant availability of the on-call physician is merely an attribute of modern medicine, and yet it's an attribute that actually got forged from the development of specific technologies. The pager produces similar sort of technologies about the accessibility of the physician as did the telephone. By 1913, the California State Medical Journal published another bit of doggerel. Now, as a historian, I use bad poetry a lot, that no doubt resonated with many of their readers. It's here, appreciation of the telephone, and it begins and ends with a couplet, "Tinkle, tinkle, little bell, how I wish you safe in hell." And you see up here a portrait of the bedside telephone. This is an article that came out as physicians began to realize it was not enough to have one phone in the house and one phone in the office, that you had to have one by the bedside as well. And these are aspects of life that we find actually not so surprising, and yet they actually cause significant ruptures in expectations at the time. A year earlier, Ellen Firewell began her memoir story of a doctor's telephone as told by his wife in 1912. With a description of the telephone as an ambivalent artifact of medical modernity. And I'll read you the whole quote. It says, "So is the telephone in the doctor's house, so great a necessity that we cannot conceive of life without it, so great a blessing that we are hourly grateful for it. and yet a very great tyrant whose dominion is absolute. And so she wrote an entire book from the perspective of the telephone. And again, this helps us begin to recapture the cultural significance of what we now think of as a relatively banal object. I want to shift to a different domain of ethical concern, which is the privacy, which began, one can find in medical legal discussions in the 1950s. Here's a JAMA article in the mid-1950s, a public relations manual put out by the American Medical Association, very similar to that conversation about the ethics of medicine around telemedicine today, about the use of the phone. And there were concerns over breaches of privacy made possible by the telephone, that a receptionist might inadvertently leak parts of the patient's medical record to people nearby when she was actually speaking. Of course, a very gendered conversation. There were classes of etiquette of how to properly use these new technologies of telephones. There are classes offered here in Mount Sinai Hospital in Cleveland in 1958, emphasizing the proper way to use the telephone. And these are not just for secretaries, but they include consultants, doctors, interns, nurses, aides, dietitians, secretaries, and technicians. And one finds a lot of literature on this, the problem of the proper etiquette of telephone use to prevent breaches of privacy. This article from 1972 shows how such concerns actually linger. Here's a quote: "The first contact a patient makes with the physician is often annoyance, busy signal. That says in effect, quote, 'I'm too busy right now, I can't answer your call, try later.' After a few repeat callbacks and more busy signals, the patient, who is now full of a series of expletives, decides to call into the office, which at least has time to discuss making an appointment. And new technologies are actually devised to solve the problem of the technological leakiness of private information to telephone. You see baffles and windscreens are made to surround telephone receptors. So again, this concept that social problems of new technologies can best be solved by more new technologies. I want to briefly glance at some questions of equity that began to emerge as you read through the discussion around the introduction of telephones into practice. And this is both in terms of equity of access to care and equity of care itself. Is the care received by a telephone the same as the care that you would get in person? But to think first about access, as the telephone became a somewhat irritating necessity in medical practice, so too did expectations of the basic infrastructure of medical care. And you can track a series of medical legal discussions in medical journals in the 1920s to the 40s over the responsibility of physicians first to all have telephones, then to answer them, and then to actually have them answer themselves. You see here an article on a robot telephone, which is an early term for the recording machine or answering service for a physician. So an entirely new social and labor formation of the physician's answering service needed to be created around the ethical responsibilities of physicians towards access on their telephone. And the consequences of the unanswered telephone begin to emerge in the mid-20th century. By 1960, the British Medical Journal carries the first reports of culpable neglect of telephone as a form of medical malpractice. And of course, I don't need to say as a historian that such a form of malpractice is not possible in a world before telephones. And so we see the way in which the insertion of new technologies shifts social and ethical responsibilities of physicians to their patients in ways that were not anticipable beforehand. Here's the article on the first report of culpable neglect of telephone that I've been able to find in the literature. Now, another literature develops, though, over to what extent kinds of diagnosis and therapeutics can be delivered with equal fidelity in sufficient similarity across these new communications mediums. And this is a question I'm very interested in. My last book on generic drugs hinged around questions of similarity. Some of the core ethical questions surrounding generic drugs is, how do we know that they are sufficiently the same as the brand name drugs as to be therapeutically exchangeable? We know generic drugs are not identical to brand name drugs, but we like to believe that the structures we put in place make them similar in all ways that matter and make those differences trivial. And a similar conversation happens around the fidelity of care that takes place through telemedical encounters. And we see this with early reports. The earliest one I've been able to find is 1929, an article from the Prensa Medica Argentina, which develops a means of analyzing key parameters of a chest x-ray to a series of measurements that convey in numerical form via telephone, much like a telegraph, like a code book, key dimensions of a chest x-ray. And this then gets supplanted in the 40s by a field that calls itself teleognosis. The author here, Gershon Cohen, develops a way of sending X-ray images through telephone that would come across across with sufficient granularity to make key diagnoses. But of course, this raises a raft of questions. Well, would the same radiologist with the film in person be able to make the same diagnoses that they could with a more granular image that comes through the telephone? They also refer to this as telephone facsimile. And of course, the answer is, well, for some conditions and some people, yes, and for other conditions, other people, no. And how does one know at what point in time that difference is actually crucial enough to make it unethical to practice medicine using that technology? Similar concerns come if the telephone begins to be attached to all other different ways of sensing and transmitting information about the body. And what I want to suggest here, this is part of how the telephone begins to become made banal, right? So here we see, for example, electrocardiograms, the ability of sending EKGs by telephone. And the focus here in the technology is on the EKG. Of course, the telephone's there, but it begins to take a bit more of a backstage role. And we see a 1958 report on telecardiology is the ability of actually stretching the diagnostic power of cardiologists over larger geographic territory provides this ideal of giving access to more patients over a wider geographic realm, especially in rural areas, access to specialists, and yet it brings with it concerns over fidelity at the same time. And as the literature develops over fields like telecardiology, so a great part of the ink that is written is about trying to establish these what are at core ethical concerns about similarity and fidelity, similarity and difference. Here we see in 1964 the establishment of long-distance cardiology servers by telephone. And again, in the picture you see the demonstration. The telephone is there, but it's in the backstage. It's part of a grid of an infrastructure of how information is communicated rather than the emerging technology itself. So too with fetal electrocardiogram strips, we see here an aide demonstrating, this is a bit dark in this image, but you can see himself, part of this health worker's job is to hold the telephone to this new machine that transmits fetal cardiograms to obstetricians in academic medical centers. And as this field grows to more and more sensing technologies being attached to the telephone system, you can see here a key moment from this in Atlantic City in 1963 when the AMA convention features a live display of telemedicine, where multiple forms of data sent between 3 cities in Massachusetts, Minnesota, and New Jersey, and all being broadcast live on stage in Atlantic City. And there's a quote attached to this presentation that finally, it is expected that a small portable telemedography set will be made available in the foreseeable future to the physician, thereby establishing his bioelectric consultant no farther away than the nearest telephone plug. And as a plug, I'll pass one other prop around, which is a book. And if you open to the bookmark there, this is a book of Michael Crichton's that in the aftermath of, say, Jurassic World, many will not remember. But his first book was actually published just after his 3rd year of medical school, after he did his rotation to the Massachusetts General Hospital in 1968. And one of his rotations was on the newly established telemedical unit at MGH, which created a data link between Logan Airport and the Massachusetts General Hospital. And so, again, I want to suggest that this telemedical imagination, by the time we hit the 1960s, is resting around this kind of infrastructure. So the same questions that were applied to telephone in the late 19th, early 20th century are now being applied to this broader multiplex system. They're different, and the different forms of information are being transmitted. Different labor functions are being performed by a special telemedicine unit in MGH. And yet, at core, they actually relate to basic questions that are recurring questions of the new communications technologies and what they do to medicine. We see it similarly in medical literature after the 1960s. In 1969, just as the fantasy of telemedicine now includes the computer as the key new technology to be reckoned with, we see the telephone nonetheless necessary. Here's an article on the telephone as a computer input-output terminal for medical information, showing ways of adapting the telephone to make the telephone effectively into a computer that can transmit lab values, pharmacy information. And again, we continue to see this literature around this problem of fidelity. Here's a very interesting article in Geriatrics in 1972, which presents 3 cases in which, quote, an erroneous diagnosis was made because the physician assumed that the current illness represented an exacerbation of a recurrence of the previous trouble by making diagnostic and therapeutic recommendations by telephone, and focuses on key points of what was missed and what effectively the ethical breach in that relationship was by relying on the communications technology. So I spent a lot of time there. I just want to introduce one more set of questions. There's probably not time to get into it in great detail, which is this concern of the telephone as a public good or private good. And this is something that I think we see develop with every platform of technology, because along the way, any technology as it's developed can take either privately supported or utility, a publicly supported or utility function, or privately supported or more commodity circulation. And certainly within the telephone industry, we see the fact that a number of physicians become owners of telephone companies in their local towns. And so there's this odd process whereby physicians are actually owning this means of communication that they then communicate with their patients over. This is in the early days of the industry, well before the bells. And again, it's not too hard to trace similar problems that happen, say, as CT suites and MRI suites begin to be owned by physician cooperatives. So the broader financial implications of how investment in telemedicine plays out into the public good versus private interest is exceptionally important to pay attention to in the expanding world of health today. And I would say that if we go back, now I showed you this picture early on saying I was going to end my story with the moment at which Rashid Bashir is writing about these exciting new telemedical platforms in the 60s and 70s. Now many of these programs are publicly funded. So one of the two books that I'm hoping to write out of this is about this moment between 1959 and 1979, in which there are about 12 different federally funded integrated telemedical systems that are built with public funds to try and address problems of disparities of access to medical care. And you could probably imagine where these programs are set up. So just a question for you. So each of these programs has an academic medical center that gets the grant. It has a marginalized population that is the target population to demonstrate that telemedicine can actually expand access to care. Can you as a room, you should probably be able to field all of them. What kind of populations are being imagined here in the great society, post-war order of liberal imagination, using technology to solve problems of social disparities in access? What do you think? Native Americans, yes. And so this program on the right here is one that I have particular interest in, called StarPack. It's funded by NASA. And it's a conjoint program of NASA, the Indian Health Service, and the Lockheed Missile and Space Company. And effectively, NASA and Lockheed have developed the telemedical system for what were supposed to be interplanetary travel. And then after some budget struggles, got knocked down to the space shuttle. And they developed this unit, and they needed, on the one hand, to demonstrate terrestrial benefits. I'll go back to the Tang example. And also to actually test it on human population. And it was tested in the arid Sonoran Desert on what is now the Tohono O'odham Reservation at the border between Arizona and Mexico. And so I'm doing oral histories and just passing around Python work. It's a very complicated story. But the idea here is that this technology of building a telemedical system that would help astronauts could also be deployed to help Native American populations. There's another program where the grant goes to Stanford to use satellites to deliver care to Inuits. But other thoughts, other populations. Who else might be considered an underserved population from a healthcare perspective in the 1960s and 1970s domestically? Appalachia. So yeah, so there's a rural white population. Although Appalachia didn't get the grant. The grant in this case went to Dartmouth to fund work on rural white farming populations in northern England. But exactly, it's other populations. So migrant workers and visitors, I'm going to take that as one collective. And so so the Logan Airport process, it was a prominent way of actually looking at people who are moving transiently through the airport space.
Disabled?
Disabled, it's a great question, but wasn't specifically part of the program, but someone said prisoners. And so one of the grants goes to the University of Miami to develop, and you see on the left an artifact here of the main jail control console, the telemedical system designed between the University of Miami and the Dade County Correctional Facilities. Any more?
Poor inner city?
Poor inner city, exactly. Specifically in the racial imagination of the poor inner city African American. And there's two grants. One goes to the University of Chicago Another goes to Mount Sinai, going to Harlem. And the idea is that telemedical links will enable access, whether it's the problems of white physicians in academic centers not going into these predominantly black inner city areas, or the other way around. The idea is similar, that technology can solve these problems that are built through social geography. And as you look through these projects, it is a very interesting group of actors to study, because most of them, in the liberal imagination of the day, recognize that these are problems that are socially built, and that technology is a thin fix, and yet they still feel the responsibility that a technological fix can at least do something. And so this time period, these publicly funded approaches to use telemedical systems to solve problems of distributive justice is a fertile area, and I think it will deserve a book in its own right. And I'm just digging into the material right now. But that being said, what we find by 1979, all of these programs have both succeeded and failed. All of them successfully demonstrate the fidelity question. You can deliver good quality care that both physicians, other health workers, and patients themselves are satisfied with. But then by 1979, every single one of these programs has been defunded. So they're all ceased to exist. So they've been successful and they've been unsuccessful. And what happens instead is, over the course of the 1990s, we see the growth of a largely privately funded telemedical platform, in which what drives telemedical formations today are private corporations that are able to use oftentimes speculatively financed means of producing what is a more thriving space. It's continuing in a way that none of these programs do, but its connection to questions of social policy is much more nebulous. And again, I have a few slides here. The material here is great, and I can't present it all to you, but these are slides of the early imagination from the StarPac program, which stood for Space Technology Applied to Rural Papago Advanced Healthcare. And you see the main console, in which you have the physician in this new role of the telemedical operator, and their reimagination of the clinic as a zone of telemedical engagement. And for those of you that have been able to open the Michael Crichton book, again, this book, 5 Patients, is his first book. One of those patients exists in a room like this in Boston Logan Airport, and is getting care remotely delivered. And now these programs made use of telephones. And if you look at this picture, and this is again StarPac, and you see here the relay station, which is ultimately built on the top of Mount Kihatoa on the Tohono O'odham Reservation. There's wireless technology, microwave technology being used, but there's also existing telephone lines. So there is this key grid of what was formerly a new technology that still remains a part, even in the background, of telemedical imagineers. Now today I've only talked about telephones. Were you willing to sit here for several more hours? We could have the same conversation around the television. We could talk about how cable in the 1970s was this radical networking moment that was going to produce what many social planners saw as the wired nation in the 1970s. We could look at very well-developed programs, for example, the use of television in psychiatric diagnosis and therapy, and the imagination at this moment in time, late 50s and 60s, of the different possible functions that television could actually use, two-way television with the camera and the TV, and reimagining not just care, but also research, ward administration, grants administration, and things like family visits and the social and humanistic dimensions of being hospitalized. And many of these projects did actually take shape. Here are staff members on this program using the technology to talk about in order to run their staff meetings. Similarly, we get conversations around satellites or the introduction of the computer. But to bring this to a conclusion, so we have time to talk, I want to suggest that visions of telemedicine have been both potentiated and constrained by existing communications technologies. That much as we see the banalization of the telephone in this image, it's the old technology in this formation. It's a kind of infrastructure no longer noteworthy, yet a crucial part of establishing a scaffolding of new infrastructures to build the telemedical imaginary of its day and potentiate the practice of medicine at a distance. And successive generations of reimagining the promise or the perils of telemedicine continue to forget about the older technologies that made it possible before them. Now, as we consider the future of telemedicine today, it's important to reconsider past futures of medicine, some of which came to pass. And here's a comic from the 1960s, in which we see diagnoses have already been made for measurements which were transmitted automatically to doctors thousands of miles away, exclamation point. Computers, too, have helped in diagnosis. So some of these telemedical futures have already come to pass. And others of them have not yet. These are remaining panels from this ad, in which you basically see here that someday a patient will step into an examination booth and put on an instrumented suit A diagnostic computer will receive the telemetered information, and after checking with physicians, will automatically prescribe a course of action while wait. And depending on how you look at this image, this is either wonderful or it's terrifying. It's either incredibly meaningful or it's perhaps utterly incidental. If you look closely at what's actually happening here, the diagnosis that's being given is cold in the head. And the therapy coming out is take 2 aspirins, call in the morning, and start, I think it's to take 2 aspirins, remain in bed. And so what I want to suggest in here is that these past futures are very important to consider as we consider our present problems with the future that remains unknown to us today. And as we attend this digital revolution in medicine with an eye towards what came before, there are analogs in analog it behooves us to explore. Thanks very much for your attention.
As is our convention, and Jeremy has been forewarned, we have about 15 minutes for questions. You want to just field?
Oh, of course, I'll field questions.
So.
Thank you. That was very interesting. So I'm a clinician, and I wonder what you think about how patients perceive the use of technology, be it a phone, be it an email, be it my portal, and how that is changing the practice of medicine from the patient's perspective. I know that I have patients who some patients take great luxury in communicating things to me that I am shocked they would even consider sending me an email when I told them, I'll check my email at 6 in the morning and 9 o'clock at night, meanwhile their kid is in the throes of some bad illness, and they're just communicating this via email or something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question. I think that, so one thing I'd say is that as a historian, I constantly have to tack between emphasizing continuity, and a lot of what I talked about in this talk is showing continuities between our present concerns over mHealth, eHealth, and things that were happening. There was such a thing as a telephone earlier. But we have to be very attentive to changes as well, because the smartphone is not the same thing as Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. And even more importantly, as you're suggesting, the set of social expectations of what is okay and what kind of information one should share versus keep private in an era of social medicine is clearly undergoing radical shifts, which sometimes segment on generational lines, what things college students are comfortable sharing through Snapchat, parental-kid conversations around this are very difficult. And I look to anthropologists for someone like Sherry Turkle, for example, who's done some really remarkable work of how young people in America today have entirely different assumptions over notions of prophecy and what should be shared. I think this leaches into what you're discussing about your patients and what kinds of things they're comfortable sharing with you over email, which is very non-secure form of communication. And also what kinds of expectations they would have about the instantaneity of your ability to reply. What is an acceptable duration for you to wait? What kind of boundaries can you draw around yourself and say what? And I've had this problem myself with my mobile phone. I called a patient to let him know that I had given a prescription. I used my own mobile, and then he started texting me. And I hadn't even thought that but of course, having received a call from mobile when he could, and the information he was sending me was very, very sensitive information. It was entirely insecure, and I couldn't get him to stop. I kept on getting these text after text. So part of what we're talking about is that even if we as individual clinicians or as we as a society begin to try and build rules or codes of conduct, standards of conduct, it's very problematic to understand what patients will accept if they share a very different sensibility of what should be private. But that's just the beginning of the conversation. Okay. Yes?
First of all, I enjoyed your talk very much. I think one of the issues that we also are dealing with increasingly is requests to give second opinions. Like say, I'll send you a bunch of records and give a second opinion by mail without seeing the patient. And sometimes those requests come from patients, sometimes they come from other doctors, sometimes it's across the country. And it raises all sorts of issues regarding accountability, liability, quality. Can you even do that if you're
great question. I think here we get into issues of governance as well, right? Because so much of liability is meted out at some sort of level of tort law on the one hand, but also state by state jurisdiction on the other. And so one of the problems that telemedicine poses that is becoming increasingly visible is, at least in the United States, in the balance of federal rights versus states' rights, the states have the rights of controlling the limitations of the professions, right? So the regulation of the medical profession is a state-by-state affair. But the very concept of telemedicine actually neutralizes that notion of space and state catchment area. And so how to actually think about questions of liability over these distances has become a real jurisdictional problem. Certainly when the StarPack program was being built, one of the reasons it was located in Arizona was because Arizona was one of the few states that allowed physicians' assistants to operate at a distance from physicians. It's a very contentious issue at that moment in time. So these issues of liability are really important. But the other way I'd answer that question is, in a sense, it's not as new as we might think it is. So, if you were to see, if you were to refer a patient to an oncologist, oftentimes what an oncologist would need to begin to make some diagnostic and therapeutic recommendations are the scans and the slides, right? So if you need staging and grading, and of course a good oncologist needs a lot more than that, right? They need to know the patient, to know their goals, to know their support structure. And yet on some level, the slides and the films are what is oftentimes thought of as the core of that diagnostic and therapeutic prospect. So in a sense, this session has been going on for a long time. The ways that slides move diagnostically, even in, say, the late 19th century or 1930s. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the problem that you're getting at can actually be looked at from the historical problem as well. But it's a great question. Thank you. Yes? Sure, yeah.
So I work in genetics where we have a lot of discussion about whether technologies like whole genome sequencing are disruptive or not. And I wondered, in your view, what are the criteria for a technology to be considered disruptive, and how helpful is that characterization in the first place? What do you get from kind of framing something that way?
That's a great question. How many of you use the term paradigm shift in your regular conversations, seminars here and there, right? So of course, now that's a term which we associate with the work of the philosopher and historian of science, Thomas Kuhn. And yet, paradigm shift had a very specific meaning to Kuhn, but then in its broader societal uptake has become something that almost anyone trying to say anything to a boardroom anywhere for a while needed to say, well, this is a total paradigm shift in the way we do business, right? And my argument for disruptive technology would be similar. I think the term is linked to, of course, to Clay Christensen's work at Harvard Business School, and yet for something to get funded on Sand Hill Road, as to be attractive to Silicon Valley speculative capital, the argument like that phrase disruptive technology almost just, it's like part of the drinking water, right? It's like you can't even have a way of approaching potential investors without saying that. So it's a way, I don't mean to just be cynical. I think cynical would be to suggest that I thought there was a peer meeting and now it's been debased. But I actually think that many terms undergo this thing we would call onomastic drift, as a term shifts in meaning over time. And right now, it's just part of the social reality of entrepreneurship, is that everything has to be called disruptive. So the question, though, is there really a way of knowing when a technology really is disruptive, is something I think I don't have a good answer to. I'm much more interested in how people use the term, and how and why we valorize disruption is something we want, right? So disruption is clearly a positive thing you need to have. And people don't say, well, our technology is disruptive, and we're really sorry about that. But it'll be okay once you put things back together. So it's a way of answering that question. I think the field of innovation studies, I would love to see more engagement between innovation studies and the history of technology. Let's see, your hand was up.
Well, I think to ask this question as I'm a surgeon, we already have a reputation of focusing on compensation, but with the evolution and these technologies, one issue that's often brought up is that patients will call or email to avoid the time cost, the actual dollar cost of the visit, whereas because we're not attorneys, we're not billing by the hour or the minute, we bill in a system based on visits. Historically, how has that evolved?
the entire, professional surgery is marked by that question. But my short answer was it has not evolved at a pace. And it's very common to have a conversation about bioethics and say, well, with these new technologies and society has not evolved to the point of understanding how to actually use these new technologies. There's a mismatch between technological evolution and social evolution. That's a bit of a teleological kind of a term to talk about that evolution, but certainly change over time. And another conversation that's very common is to say, well, we're dealing with this morbidity that's largely due to chronic disease, and we have a hospital system that's designed for acute disease, and that's a historical mismatch. And how do we get to the point where our hospital system is actually better built to reflect the actual epidemiology of now rather than the epidemiology of 50 years ago? So I would say a similar thing about our compensation structure. So a compensation structure that's based entirely on visits and that discounts phone calls and emails is going to incentivize things that take place in acute bursts, right? And is going to actually make it much more difficult to give meaningful chronic care. And I think to a certain extent, that's what the ACO was intended to solve, right? The Accountable Care Organization, the medical home, a way of trying to shift reimbursement to help create incentives, because ideally, if you have someone with congestive heart failure, you'd like for them to be on the phone regularly and communicating data and not need to come into the clinic, right? It's not good for payers or for patients to do this. And yet, as long as the reimbursement structure only counts when you're actually in admitted, we'll be working at cross purposes. And much as you're suggesting, your emailing patients as a surgeon is something you do out of your sense of professionalism and duty, and you're doing it in spite of the structure of the system rather than because of it. So I think you're correctly identifying a lag, and that a lag that is based on a valorization or a sense that primacy, physical contact, is the only valid form of medical interaction. And I think we're existing in a much different reality right now in the 21st century. But for reasons that are closely related to why the AMA was unable to come to terms with this in June, we have not been able to restructure our payment system accordingly. So I think it's a great issue. It's one I would love to see more writing on.
They were talking about it in November too, so I was at that meeting and the CJ report, no one can agree on anything related to medicine.
Yeah, so
It's really,
I think you're right. We're at a moment of impasse, and it's an impasse that is extremely non-productive because the communications media has already shifted. The ability to actually figure out what crucial things we're letting go of when we actually relax requirements on physical presence is actually in many ways injurious to people getting care in the meantime. You had a question as well.
I think that may be our last question.
Okay.
Thank you. This was very, very interesting. One comment before my question. We actually use telemedicine a lot in ophthalmology, particularly pediatric ophthalmology. For when I worked in Canada, we could do this for ROP screening for basically all of the northern territories in Ontario, because it could be 6-8 hours to get a baby from the nursery in for an ROP exam. So we would use telemedicine approaches. But you had mentioned Eric Topel earlier.
Yes.
And is it Topel or Topel? I'm not sure.
I think Topel.
Topel.
I don't know.
And I was interested in his recent book, I think it's called The Patient Plus You Know.
Yes.
And I wondered if you were going to sort of take this discussion further to talk even more about the potential distance caused by telemedicine and his whole concept of kind of democratization of medicine, and that we don't even need the doctor anymore because we've got the technology, and we can use our iPhones essentially to diagnose ourselves and treat ourselves, and eliminating the doctor from the equation. And have we gone that far?
Yes, so it's a great question, and actually it's a plug for something that I failed to pass around earlier. This is a book called Post-Physician Era, and it was a book that came out in 1976, and there's a whole chapter here on specifically how the circulation of computers and telemedical technologies will do away with the need for the physician altogether. So in a sense, we can historicize that. Even Topel's claim that the smartphone is what's really going to do it. You have earlier generations saying, well, actually, cable television is what's really going to do it. With cable television, you're not going to need the doctor anymore. And so part of what I would say historically is not to dampen Topel's enthusiasm. Well, he's clearly a booster, right? That's the role he's chosen for himself. But to suggest that he's not the first, there will probably be other people in the future that will be taking on that role as well. And that there are reasons why that vision of democratization, although it's been around for some time, doesn't fully come to pass. The other thing I would say is in that book, he talks in very glowing terms about Theranos, for example, And Theranos is a way of talking very broadly about our the sort of continuing bubble process that happens with new technologies, that we invest new technologies with all kinds of democratizing potential, and then pick up the pieces afterwards when only some of it comes to pass. So I am very interested in this notion of what is DIY medicine in this era, but much like the phrase disruptive technology, if we look under the hood of what is do-it-yourself medicine, right, this democratizing process of using your smartphone to avoid the doctor, you're exchanging one paternalism for another, right? I would argue it's a form of substituted paternalism where you are no longer beholden to your physician, but you are now beholden to this app that you've purchased, to this, $300 electronic stethoscope that plugs in that only works with your iPhone, and to the company itself. And so one of the interesting things here is what is actually being democratized in this vision of do-it-yourself technology. It's not going to Radio Shack and just building everything on the cheap. It's actually very expensive. There's high costs, and there's a shift of who is actually in control from a medical profession to speculatively finance startup firms. So this is not to throw too much water on it, but just to suggest that, that I think that the language of DIY and democratization carries within it more complicated politics than Total might be able to unpack. But thanks for the question. Thanks for all your time.